daily life like? And what were your parents like? And what was Ronnie like?
Well, for the first 13 years of my life, I lived on a farm. I was born in Brownfield, Texas. Lived at Tokyo most of the time, and that was west of Brownfield, close to the New Mexico border. My parents farmed 1 square mile, a section of land. About 40 acres of that was pasture, so we had some cows and horses occasionally. But for the most part, Dad grew cotton and grain sorghum. When I was old enough, and that means about 10 years old, I started driving a tractor and helping in the fields. I would sometimes drive the tractor with plows to cultivate, to cut down the weeds, or to pull a breaking plow or a stalk cutter or some other implement. We used John Deere tractors, which were also known as popping Johnnies because of the very loud noise they made. They had no heaters in the winter, no shades in the summer, so it was both hot and cold. It was my job to help take care of the livestock, the chicken and the cattle. And I didn't do that in the mornings during school, but when school was not in session, I helped to feed and take care of the cattle in the morning. And every afternoon, cows had to be milked, calves and cows either separated or put together, other animals fed and put in their proper places. Every night at dusk, the chickens would go into the chicken house, and there were poles, horizontal poles in the house that they roosted on. As soon as they were all in, it was my job to close the door and lock it for the night. That was to keep predators like coyotes out of the chicken house. They would go into the chicken house and kill the chickens if they could get in. So it was a safety measure. Our farm was 26 miles from, 30 miles from town, 26 miles from school. And we would always go into town on Saturday about mid-morning. And one of the highlights of the day was to get a hot dog at the hot dog stand, either for lunch or for supper. And we'd usually stay until about 10 o'clock at night. That's when all the week's shopping was done, groceries were bought, any clothing, any farm supplies that Dad knew he needed. And then we visited with families, with my grandparents. They were always there. The Henson grandparents lived in town by this time. We would usually go by their house for a while. The Johnson grandparents came in to do their shopping, and we would meet them on the courthouse square. And that's where all the other families were meeting as well. And so you got a parking place and left the car there all day and into the night. Children would often go to the movies. I went to see Roy Rogers and Gene Autry and other cowboy films. I believe it cost 12 cents to go to the movie. Comic book was a dime. A Coke was a nickel. And so usually the Saturday routine would be to get a Coke and a comic book at the drugstore soda fountain. Read the comic book, then go to the movie. Popcorn was probably a nickel, not more than a dime. And watched a couple of movies and cereals. Came out, by then it was supper time. Have the hot dog or the hamburger. And then play on the courthouse lawn with other kids while the adults visited in the parking places around the courthouse. When all the stores closed and got to be about 10 o'clock, then everybody headed home. It was usually about 11 o'clock when we got home. And that was when I had to go down and close the chicken house door in the dark, and it seemed like a long ways. I'm sure it was only a few yards from the house, but on those dark nights when I was young, it took me a long time to get the chicken house, but a very short time to get back after I got the door locked. A couple of times during my childhood, I had a pony. When I was 6, I had a pony for about a year. It was a little bit cantankerous. It would bite, kick, and so we didn't keep it. When I was about 11 or 12, we were breaking out some land, deep plowing land, and growing some Sudan on it that cattle could eat. And we put the cows out on the pasture and borrowed a horse. It was a cross between a full-size horse and a Shetland from a neighbor. And the saddle was too big for me. I couldn't reach the stirrups, but it was my job to make sure that the cattle stayed in our field and to wander over to the neighbors. And one day, Dad drove out to see how I was doing, maybe to bring me a drink or a sandwich. And the pickup scared the horse, and the horse started running, probably running for home, which was a couple of miles away. And since I couldn't reach the stirrups, had nowhere to put my feet, I held onto the saddle horn and slid. I'd slide from one side until I could reach the stirrup, and then regain my balance and slide to the other side till I could reach the stirrup. I was frightened. The horse was frightened. And Dad was frightened. He was chasing me in the pickup. And the faster he came, the more frightened the horse became and ran faster. Finally, I fell off of the horse. Of course, it was fortunate the ground was freshly plowed and soft. And I was lucky, I guess, that Dad didn't run over me. But that was an exciting adventure. Shortly after that, when I was 13, I think, I got a horse that I kept for a couple of years until we moved into town, and spent most of my time with the horse. Since we lived so far in the country, I had very few playmates except at school. A mile away was a girl about a year younger than I, and I really didn't want to play with her. I was at the age that I didn't want to play with girls. The only boys lived at least 2 miles away, so I mostly played with myself. Ronnie was 6 years younger than I, and so I could play with him some in the house and do certain things, but the sorts of things that I really wanted to do, I had to do alone. And so the horse became a good companion, and I wanted to be a cowboy, so I would rope things from the horse and make equipment for the saddle and all sorts of things, groom the horse, and so on. And that was a lot of fun. I sometimes came home from school and the family would be gone. This was before Ronnie started school, and they would be away for an hour or two after I got home, and I would get a snack, play outside. The house was never locked. No one then locked their houses, especially in the country. It was assumed that if neighbors had an emergency and needed to get into your house, they could and would, and wouldn't disturb anything else. But you didn't worry about burglars. But I came in and sometimes I would go hunting for rabbits. I had a .22 rifle. And once I banged it on the chair going out the door and shot a hole in the kitchen floor, which was a little disconcerting to me. I wasn't quite sure what Mom was going to say because it was brand new floor covering, vinyl, and I shot a hole in it. But I think she was so scared, so relieved that I wasn't hurt when she got home that I didn't get in trouble for shooting a hole in the floor. And we got rid of the gun because it was worn out. That's why it went off accidentally. The parts were worn. For the most part, I entertained myself, played by myself. I read a lot. It was one of the things I could do. We didn't have a lot of books in the house, couldn't afford a lot of books, but we did have a set of Compton's encyclopedias, and I probably read most of those encyclopedias through the elementary and middle school years. I went to school first through fourth grade at Gomez, which is 5 miles west of Brownfield and part of the Brownfield district. Then in fifth grade, I went to Plains, and back to Gomez for the sixth grade, and then seventh, eighth, and the beginning of the ninth grade, back to Plains. I lived just a mile from the boundary between the two districts, and so transferred into the Plains district. About 6 weeks into the ninth grade year, we moved to Farwell, and so I went to school there on through high school. That was when we lived in town. I kept the horse Sandy for about 6 months after we moved to town, but it was too expensive, and she was always pinned up, confined, so finally sold her and the saddle and everything else. Okay.
What were your parents like, and what was the most important thing about them that you want Ronnie and?
Oh, okay. My parents were Clay and Irene Henson. Irene Henson, her maiden name was Johnson. They had met and married in Brownfield. Dad was a farmer. He was the eldest of 10 children. 2 of his sisters died before I was born. One was the oldest girl. She died in childbirth at age 21, I believe, in 1938. And then Marie, one of the younger girls, she may have been the youngest, and died at age 14 of a ruptured appendix before they could get adequate medical care. So there are 8 surviving children that lived on to a full age. Dad was 24 and Mom was 22 when they married. They were both quite slender, both from farm families. Dad's family had come from Oklahoma. Mom's family had been in East Texas until they both moved to the Brownfield area in the 20s and early 30s. So farming is all they knew. Dad had dropped out of school in the 10th grade, and that was when school only went through the 11th. So he lacked about a year and a half finishing. Mom had graduated from high school at Campbell near Greenville in East Texas. The thing I remember most about my parents, both of them, were their character. Dad was scrupulously honest in all of his dealings, and taught us kids that way. A lot of business dealings during my youth between farmers, among farmers, and other businesses were done without the benefit of contracts and lawyers. In those days, you went to a lawyer only if you were doing something like buying or selling land or other property that required legal documents. It probably never occurred to him to sue anyone. He dealt with people he thought he could trust, and usually they made an agreement, they shook hands, and for people like him, farmers all over the country, I suppose, but particularly in Texas, if you gave your word and shook hands on a deal, you were honor bound to keep it. And if you didn't, you would be pretty well ostracized from the community. Nobody would do business with you again. Nobody would trust you. And so there was no need for written contracts. Sometimes there was a piece of paper more as a record than as a contract. The grain elevator operator would probably give you a written price quote for what he would pay for the grain, and cotton gin likewise. But those were sales receipts and so on, more than there were formal contracts. The word would have been just as good. So they both had very high character. They were both concerned about helping out in the community. What that meant in the farm community was when neighbors need you, you go and you help, you do whatever is necessary. Sometimes that meant if someone's house burned down, or if they had an accident or an illness, then the neighbors would go in and help to rebuild the house or plow the fields or harvest the crop until the family was back on its feet. Later on, when we moved to Farwell, Dad served on the school board without pay and during some pretty hard times. Dad went on the school board in 1954, I believe, and shortly after he went on the school board, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which desegregated all public schools. All across the South, communities refused to desegregate their schools, maintain separate, racially segregated schools. In Farwell, however, they desegregated in the next year, in 1955. Now, that didn't mean what it would have meant in Louisiana or Mississippi. Out of about 300 students in the entire district, only about 30 were black. Previous to that, the school district had a contract with Clovis, New Mexico schools, and black kids went to their black schools. But they came to school on our campus the following fall, and for one semester they were in a separate building. But then in the spring semester, all the black kids were mainstreamed into the regular classes. And one of my great regrets is that I never talked to Dad about what happened on the school board when that decision was made. I later talked to the superintendent about it, and his memory was that it went very smoothly. There was one board member who opposed. Everyone else simply said, you know, it's the law of the land, it's what we need to do, it's the right thing, and so let's do it. And there were no uprisings in the community. There was some criticism, but in general, the community accepted it. Probably one of the things that helped that is that 3 of the high school boys were good athletes, and they improved the teams, and so they were accepted, even though I would find out later that the one of the boys that stayed in school all the way to graduation did not go on the senior trip with us, and what we found later was that he had been given his share of the money, probably plus some more money, not to go. And I suspect that was more out of avoiding difficulties with hotels and restaurants and so on the trip than it was people not wanting him to go along with the rest of us. I don't know that, but that's my guess. Mother was very active in church. She volunteered as the director of youth activities all the time I was in high school and for several years afterwards while Ronnie was in high school. And she spent a great deal of time there, donating her time. So I think both of them had a strong sense of community responsibility. They were interested in both local and state and national politics. They always voted. I never knew them to miss voting in any election. They felt a responsibility to do that. Although, except for the school board, neither of them ever ran for office. Ronnie, my younger brother, was a lot different than me. He was tall. He was about 6'1", so 7 inches taller than I, a lot heavier, and had interests different from mine. I think because of my early years on the farm and my dependence on books for entertainment information, I was always pretty bookish and interested in horses, animals, and so on. He turned out to be interested in cars and music and mechanical things. I think his real ambition, whereas mine was to be a cowboy, his was to be a race car driver. But he loved mechanical things, and he became the lawnmower mechanic for Farwell in Dad's hardware store, and could fix just about any small engine. He had, when he got old enough to have a car, he fixed it up as a hot rod and took great pride in it. And when he was killed at age 21, had a 56 Chevrolet hardtop sport coupe, red with white leather upholstery that he had done himself, and a red Ford pickup that he had customized. And those were important to him. He also was roommate at what was then Arlington State, now University of Texas at Arlington, with Kenny Bernstein. And Kenny went on after college to become a drag racer, and over the next 30 years would break almost every drag racing record on the books. Ronnie was studying accounting and racing, and probably, had he lived, would have been on Bernstein's racing team some way as mechanic or accountant or something.
Why did you choose religion and philosophy as your profession?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question.
That's pretty philosophical.
Yeah. I can remember from very early years being interested in questions of what I would now call philosophical nature. Religious questions such as the existence of God and life after death and so on, but also the relationship between the body, the physical part of us, and the mental part, the mind, and especially as I learned more in school about biology and the brain. I wondered how to separate the mind from the brain. I read some Freudian psychology in high school. That opened up a lot of questions about the origin of religion, whether religion was something that had been given to human beings or something that we had figured out and invented for ourselves. I saw a great deal of value in what the church, what religion stood for. The church was the primary agency in Western society that promoted morality, moral behavior, responsibility, and those were things I felt were very important. It also promoted accountability. There were a lot of things about religion that troubled me. I remember when the Supreme Court decision on desegregation came down from the Supreme Court, soon thereafter having a Sunday school lesson, taken from the 9th chapter of Genesis, the story of the curse of Ham, and that lesson was used to prove that God intended the races to be separate and so forth. So religion was used sometimes to justify prejudices. I always had the feeling that a lot of popular religion was more superstition than solid ideas, and so I wanted to explore that. Beyond that, there were two people in town during my high school years that were intellectuals who worked with ideas. Well, I should say two kinds of persons. One were the lawyers. They had intellectual jobs, they worked with ideas, and I was somewhat attracted to law, but a lot of what I saw lawyers doing didn't think I would like to do. The minister was the other fellow who read books, who thought about what he read, and put those ideas into sermons and delivered them into the people. And so I thought that's what I would like to do. That was my intention when I left for college. During my freshman year in college, I decided that I still wanted to stay in the same area, religion, but I wanted to teach rather than to be a preacher. Of course, in those days, to teach religion, you also had to be a preacher, and you had to have the credentials. So I went through college, majoring in religion, went to seminary, got a seminary degree, which wasn't a very happy experience because the seminary was in some turmoil during the time, and went on then to get a doctorate in philosophical theology, or philosophy of religion, and got to dig into the questions that I had that I thought were important at some depth, and then have been teaching those ever since. That's my best guess as to what drew me into the field, is admiration for the intellectuals in my community who just happened to be the preachers.
So you met Mom when you went to college in your freshman year?
Right.
What was it that attracted you to her, and why did you fall in love with her?
Well, we were in English class together, and this English class was a special class. It was an experimental class that had been proposed and organized and was taught by the one professor on the English faculty who was probably the most intellectual person there. Mom was, of course, in nursing school, and he thought that nurses who, in those days, had separate classes. It was all nurses in English class and chemistry class and biology class and so forth. He thought they needed to be integrated in among the other students, at least for their general studies. Nursing, of course, the nursing classes would be separate. And so he had prevailed on the dean to allow him to teach two sections with nursing students, those who could qualify, and other students who scored highly on the English exam, the entrance exam. So she and I wound up in the same early afternoon English class. I think there were 18 students in the class. About half of them were nurses, and half non-nurses, just from the general student body. And these were the 30 or 40 from among the 30 or 40 people who had scored highest on the English test. And he was experimenting with us. He wanted to see, one, how could nurses integrate into the regular student body, how that would work. And two, he experimented with the curriculum. He had us read books from the St. John's list. St. John's is a university in Maryland, a liberal arts college, the curriculum of which, for 4 years, is reading the 100 great books of the Western world. Now, of course, it's the faculty at St. John's that decides which of the 100 greatest books. But we read from that list. And I'll have to confess that I probably didn't understand more than 10% of what I read in my books. I read from Kierkegaard, I can't remember which books I read now, but all philosophy books, and very difficult, for someone who's never had a philosophy course at all, and I hadn't at that time. All of that is to say that I knew she had a good mind, and that was important to me. It was also obvious that she was very attractive. She was physically attractive. She was happy, had a good personality, vibrant. She laughed a lot. So I asked her out on a date at the encouragement of one of her friends, who sort of played matchmaker to us. And we hit it off quite well. We were both interested in church, and that was a good excuse for us to be together. So we'd go to church 3 times a week together. She had to be in at 8:30 every night during the week, so we could go get a Coke early, and I'd get her in and we could study. That was our dating. We could be out until 10 o'clock on weekends, 8:30 during the week. But found ourselves to be very compatible, interested in the same things. And so pretty soon, I think both of us had decided that we'd rule out everybody else and concentrate on one another. And so it grew from there.
What do you think are the most important things to have in a marriage?
I think one of the secondary things of lesser importance is romance, because romance is sometimes mistaken for commitment. What I think is important is trust and commitment. Trust meaning you trust the other person implicitly. Commitment means that you go into the marriage with everything you have. You're committed to stay there. You're committed to see it through, understanding that there will be hard times. There is in every relationship. And you're committed not to bail out when the going gets tough. You take the vows quite literally. And that happens. Romance makes marriage a lot of fun, but if that's all you have, it doesn't sustain the relationship when the hard times come. A romance is important, but love is not basically something you feel. Romance is the feeling. Love is the commitment. It's the thing you do. And so I would say love and commitment and trust. Good communication is important to keep that going. And all those things have to be worked on constantly. Eventually, after enough years, you come to the point where you can read one another, and communication is pretty easy. In the early years, it may be hard, but that's where the commitment comes in.
Tell us about being a father. What did it feel like to become a father?
Well, becoming a parent, and I suppose this is true for both moms and dads, becoming a parent is one of the most wonderful things about life. Part of the fun, a great deal of the fun, is in the anticipation of becoming a parent and going through the 9 months of pregnancy as a couple. In the days when your girls were born, we didn't have nearly as much information as parents do now. There were no sonograms or any of the tests that would tell you the gender of a child or health problems that you might encounter. So everything was a surprise, including what the baby was going to look like, how healthy the baby was, gender, and everything. As I look back on it, there's a lot of value. It adds a lot of excitement to be surprised like that. Although I see certainly the value in knowing about the potential problems in advance so that they can be dealt with. And I wouldn't go back to less medical technology or knowledge. But the feeling of seeing your own child for the first time is almost indescribable. It gives you a feeling of fulfillment and at the same time of responsibility that is hard to express, but it's a feeling of total joy. And then to watch an infant develop, to figure out who she looks like, how her personality is going to develop, which parent or grandparent or whatever characteristics will show up in the baby. Lots of fun.
What do you enjoy most about being a dad? Or did you when we were younger?
I enjoyed a lot about being a dad to small kids. Part of it was the play. Part of it was a kind of feeling of fulfillment at being the person that someone depends on totally, and being responsible for another life. I enjoyed the teaching, the nurturing, molding a personality. I enjoyed watching you develop, but that's a mixed kind of ambivalent feeling to watch your children grow up. When they're small and innocent and playful, it's very much fun. And when they get to be adolescents and start the breaking away, becoming independent persons, you miss the playfulness and the innocence of young childhood. And there are parts of that that are hard. On the other hand, you enjoy seeing your child develop and mature and take on responsibility, learn. And then there are those milestones of high school graduation and many before that, kindergarten graduation, and all the others, and college, marriage, and then grandchildren.
What would you like to tell your grandkids about your daughters, Cammie and Kim?
That they have wonderful mothers. Each of you girls were very lively, vibrant kids. You had neat personalities. You could be mischievous, you could be sweet. You knew how to manipulate your dad, get almost anything you wanted. Mom got frustrated with me because I wasn't disciplinarian enough. You were both probably more mature than kids your age were. You were both intelligent and worked hard at school, so you achieved a great deal. Cammie went towards music and the fine arts because of health problems, partly. About the time you were taking up music in middle school, you had your back surgery, which confined you to bed for a long time, and so you really concentrated on the music. And I don't know whether that was decisive or not, but I think it was an important part of your life. Kim, on the other hand, was interested in athletics and didn't have the same problems that you had, and so went in a different direction. Your interests were very different, your personalities were different, but you were always responsible. You were kids, you were adolescents, you did things you shouldn't have done, you got in trouble. But basically,
You don't have to tell them about those times.
honorable kids and kids that we were always very proud of. And I think I'm old enough to say and experienced enough to say that both of you are superb parents. And to the grandkids, you had as good parents as you could hope for.
Tell us about being a grandfather. How did it feel for you to become a grandfather?
Well, in a lot of ways, it's like becoming a parent, but in many ways it's different because of the distance. You're not the parent, and one of the things you want to do as a grandparent is to allow enough space so that the parents can be the parents. You don't want to take over that role. But I remember when Jeremy was born, of course there was the fright that came with his birth and the emergency delivery, and then the little heart problem that he had at the beginning that scared us all. And so there was a lot of anxiety with his birth. This was the first, of course. I remember distinctly the first day of Jeremy's life in the hospital in Houston. Kim was in college in Huntsville. When Cammie went to the hospital, she called Kim. We met her at the hospital. They called us. We were in Dallas, and so it took us longer to get there, although not nearly as long as as the speed limit would indicate. We got to the hospital just a few minutes after Jeremy had been delivered, and so that we knew he was okay. Didn't know about the emergency until we arrived, but it was the wee hours by then, about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and it took another couple of hours for things to settle down. By then, everybody was worn out. No one had any sleep that night. So David and Mom went home to clean up and sleep. Cammie was, of course, groggy from the anesthetic and labor. And that left me, I stayed at the hospital with Cammie all that day or until the early afternoon when David and Carolyn came back. And they had just begun bringing babies to the room in those days to stay. And so when Cammie was awake, she would hold Jeremy, but she wasn't awake a lot. During the first day, she slept most of the time. And so I held Jeremy almost all day. And I remember a feeling that I described to one of my colleagues afterwards. It was very emotional. As I talked to Jeremy and bonded with him and thought about his life, I had the thought that I had reached a sort of completion point in my life. That now there was a third generation, and it was okay for me to die. That I didn't want to. I was not in a hurry, but I had reached one of those sort of inborn, innate human completion points where I suppose in some Jungian way felt that my life would continue through my children and now through another generation in Jeremy. And I didn't have to be anxious about life anymore. I'd finished the main thing that I was here to do. So it was a kind of a mystical experience. I didn't have quite the same experience with the other two grandchildren because they were not first, but the thrill is the same. I suppose if you had 20 grandchildren, the thrill would always be the same of the new life and the anticipation to see how it will turn out, to see what kind of contribution you can make, to enjoy the infancy and the childhood, and to support the growth and maturity.
What's the best thing about being a grandfather? Besides spoiling them.
Well, you get to do so many of the fun things, and you don't have to do many of the unpleasant things. I try to be a responsible grandfather and not make too much trouble for the parents. But one of my roles is to spoil the kids, to let them bend the rules a little bit when they're with us, and do things they can't do with their parents. Particularly, it's been fun for Mom and me to do things with grandkids that the parents don't have time to do, or to supplement. Taking kids on vacations, taking them at our house for a week or a couple of days, as they're old enough. Both to give the parents a break and a time for some renewal and vacation, and to spend some time with the kids. And, that's fun, and I look forward to a lot more of that.
What's the most important thing you could pass on to your grandkids?
Well, I hope the grandkids will understand my values. Of course, I would hope that they would adopt my values, but they'll have to work through that each for themselves, and see the importance of honesty and compassion, caring, of involvement with other communities. Of seeing the purpose of life to make a contribution to the community, a positive contribution to make the world better, and not to get caught up in the accumulation of things and selfishness.
What do you like about fixing things and working with tools and all the woodworking that you've started doing?
Well, I guess the big reward is in times like when Ronnie said recently, "Granddad, you can fix anything." When you grow up on the farm, you have to fix things. You have to repair things. There's no time, no one else to do it often, and so of necessity you learn how to use tools, and you learn how to improvise by using materials at hand whenever you need something. And I've enjoyed that as a challenge. Since I professionally work with my mind, and particularly with abstract ideas and philosophy and theology, and to some extent even in history, as a counterpoint to that, as a balance for that, I enjoy doing things with my hands. I'm not very artistic. I'm not very good at design, or thinking up new designs, but I enjoy executing what others have designed. I get a lot of pleasure out of handling and using well-made tools, seeing what the tools will do, taking raw materials, lumber or leather or film, and with a tool like a camera or a saw or a chisel, seeing what I can make of it. Most of the things I make are useful to some extent, and I particularly enjoyed making the cradle and the rocking horses and so on for the kids, and hope that I'll be able to make some other things for them and for others. So I enjoy both the product and the process.
What are your hopes for the future? As we approach the millennium here.
I hope by the time the next millennium rolls around, people have learned to count, so that they don't think it starts in the year 3000. The millennium doesn't really start for another year, but our society doesn't accept that. We're going to have the parties January 1st, 2000. As I think back to my childhood, we had no television, we had no computers, we had no telephones. In fact, during the first 6 years of my life, we had no electricity. When I was 6, we got electric lights from a wind charger. And we would generate electricity with a generator on a tower, store it in 6-volt batteries, and we had lights. That's all, nothing else. A few years later, we did get electricity through the REA program. And after we got electricity, of course, we had then electric refrigerators, air conditioners came along, eventually television, although my family didn't have a telephone until we moved to Farwell when I was in high school. So, in the last 50 or 60 years, technology has made tremendous advances. From having no electricity, I've witnessed such things as the first trip to the moon, when Cammy was a baby, space exploration, and the computer and all the things, the internet, all the things that we have now. I've also witnessed the atomic bomb. I know in the future technology is going to continue to develop more rapidly than it has in the past. I suspect that in the future, in the next 25 to 50 years, the greatest achievements are going to be in life sciences rather than in electronics or physics, in biology, in medicine, genetics, and so forth. And my hope is that we will use the technology in a positive way rather than a negative way. It's always possible to use technology either way. The same atomic energy that produced the bomb can also produce electricity. The same genetic engineering that can produce mail-order babies, designer babies, can be used for great purposes of healing, organ generation, and so forth. And I hope that we will make positive uses of our technology rather than negative uses. That probably will be decided not by the scientists and the technicians, but rather by ordinary people as they make moral decisions. And that's where philosophy and theology has a very important role to play. Values again. I still do not know for sure in my own mind the answer to the questions about the existence of God or life after death. But I think there's great value in struggling with those questions and in assuming the values that traditional religion and philosophy have taught. Personal responsibility, caring for others, altruism, honesty will be very important as we decide what to do with the knowledge that is discovered during the rest of my lifetime and in your lifetimes. You kids will probably be very educated, much more educated than your parents or your grandparents. There will be more to know, and you will play a role in the future of the world. I hope it's responsible, and I hope that you will keep the moral values in mind, you know, as you manipulate the other knowledge, the scientific and technical knowledge that you have. Okay, this is class 11.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you live, Jeremy?
Houston, Texas.
And where do you go to school?
North Shore Middle School.
You just started middle school and just started band. And what instrument do you play in the band?
Right now the cornet, but that will become a trumpet.
Okay, so it's going to be a trumpet. And you already play what instrument?
The piano.
The piano, and quite well. Jeremy's a good musician. And what are your favorite sports?
Baseball. And soccer.
Baseball and soccer. And Jeremy's a pretty good athlete too. You have a lot of friends at school.
Mm-hmm.
Who's your best friend?
Kendall.
Kendall.
Because I see him almost every day.
You've been with him a long time, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
Since when?
I was 5 or 6, I think.
About as far back as you can remember.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, that's good. We'll stop now. Well, Jeremy, it's just after my birthday and just before yours. And Aunt Kim and your mom asked me to do this tape, and I'm glad they did. It's kind of sobering to talk to your grandkids out into the future. At 11 years old now, I know a lot about you. I know that you're very intelligent. I know that you're very talented. And I suspect that you're headed towards a big role for music in your life, either as an avocation or maybe as a vocation. But that doesn't need to be decided now. I just know that you have a lot of ability, and I admire that. I want to talk a little bit about my hopes for you, when you're grown, as you're an adult, and you live your adult life. There are two basic choices that everybody has to make, two kinds of life that we can choose to live. One is where we concentrate on ourselves and our own desires, fulfilling our own needs. The other is where we concentrate on meeting the needs of other people and making a contribution to the larger society and to the world. The first is called egoism, the second is altruism. I would hope you would choose a life that is dominated by the second of those, of altruism. If there's a key word that would mark the kind of life I would wish for you, it's integrity. Integrity means to be integrated, to be together, so that all the parts fit together and complement one another and work together. That you have your life together. That's the basic meaning of mental health. But it goes beyond that. It also means that you be true to yourself. You have a lot of talent, a lot of abilities, some of which you probably have not discovered yet. You can't live your life based on your mother's talents or your dad's talents or anyone else's. You have to discover your own and be true to yourself. You must likewise discover your own values, and you must discover your own interests. I know you have a good mind, and I hope you will think deeply about these things, particularly about your values and about your abilities. I hope you will ask the philosophical questions about them, and that you will find the answers that are most satisfactory for yourself. And then be true to those answers. One of the things I mentioned was values. I would wish for you a good, solid set of core values. 4 values in particular I would mention. The first is honesty. Always be a person that other folks can depend on. Your word is good. It's the only way that people will trust you. It's a much easier way to live than if you're always having to remember the lie you told or the excuse you gave. Just to be honest is so basic and so simple, but it's also pretty rare. And I would wish that honesty would be an important part of your core value system. Another is responsibility. I hope you'll have a family one of these days, because that's one of the great joys of life, that you will be responsible for them. But I would also hope that you would feel a responsibility to the larger society, to your community, to your country, to the world in general. Third value is fairness, or if we express this societally, it's justice. It's the notion that every person has equal value, equal worth. You treat all people alike. The only justification for treating people differently is to account for such things as handicap or age or some other rational special consideration. We don't treat people differently out of prejudice or arbitrary bias. To be fair, to be just, is to be a great person. And the final value is love. I hope you will have a family and a community with lots of people who love you and whom you can love, and that you will give yourself to those persons in a loving way. It's the most enduring of all the values, I suppose, and maybe, to double use the word, it's the most valuable of the values. Put those 4 together, you'll have a good life. I hope that you're prosperous. I hope that you're healthy. I hope that you're successful. Although those are secondary, I would much prefer that you have a happy, prosperous life, but I would much prefer that you have a significant life. And the choices you make will determine whether that's true. Good fortune may come your way, or bad. You may make money, you may not. That's not important to me in my wishes for you. Whether or not you do, I hope that you will keep your focus, that you will be courageous and responsible, and make your life count for others. In all of this, know that I'm very proud of you. I couldn't be prouder of a grandson, and I love you. Good luck and Godspeed.